My next, right. Right. First, I'll say just who I am. That's who I am. I am a chartered counselling psychologist, and why I'm saying this is because of all the different things. And one of the key things, I'm an expert witness, and I'm dealing with lots of young people involved in gang crimes and violence. And I'm also a foster carer, particularly for teenagers, where there's been particularly violent behaviours and trying to turn them around. But I have a history because I'm also was 40 years a social worker, 20 years a psychologist. And we do the maths and say, is a life long enough? Well, I did it, they overlap, so people get 2 for 1 for me, right? And which meant that I worked with a lot of violent and very disturbed and problematic teenagers, and mostly boys. So that's where I'm sort of coming from. So, oh yes. So, the history of me doing this or getting this all together was, I'm also a Labour Party activist in my South London, and my MP, who now shall be nameless, he was on the gangs committee, what to do about gangs. And I said, well, perhaps I should tell you kind of what you should be focusing on. And I said, if you're going to focus on gangs, then, and obviously the point was how to stop boys getting into violence. And I said, well, if you're going to do that, you don't start from there. You don't start by looking at the gangs. You start looking at, well, what do you do about the history? So I start my story in saying, let's look at the pre and perinatal. Now, you've had some histories now. My question is, and this is saying, first, I spend a lot of time with parents who are saying what to do about our child, whatever, and they haven't got the faintest idea because maybe they didn't have models. And I'm particularly often referring to fathers struggling. And we get this thing, you go to school, you get plenty of information about everything we talk about now. We're talking about getting more mental health in. But where are the parenting classes? All the parents come in and say, I have no idea what to do. Maybe a parent wasn't there for them. And they're saying, where's my models? So, I don't know why I'm looking up there, I've got it up here. And so, what about fathering models? Where, if, say, in the previous, certainly my generation's fathers were not there, out working, long hours, where was that for the boys? And where do we, as fathers, have the models for learning how to be a father? And who's going to tell us? Because there are no, as I said, I'm an expert witness. I do, among other things, for family and parental assessments where parents are splitting up, and I should say I actually look very much at who's going to give the most, and I don't go down always. Basically, if I look at across cases, I'm probably 50 to the male and 50% to the female. So entirely, perhaps that's why they keep calling me. But we need learning models where the fathers are equally saying, I want to be present for my children, but I don't know how, because my father was never there. So we need some learning models, and perhaps even, I've just had an email actually saying, oh no, it was somebody talking this morning, that's right, saying about where there are problem families giving them parenting, and I'm thinking, we all need parenting classes. We all need to know, and at different ages. We talk about terrible 2s and 3s, but what about the fearful 4s and frightful 5s and the sickly 6s, and the etc. You go on, and adolescence, and making note that adolescence doesn't stop at 20 for a start. But if I start at the beginning, hopefully most of you, if you're psychologists, you know about the importance of attachments. Now, I've quoted one of my tutors, who was a very amazing man, Rutter, and he made, the issues of attachment come from Bowlby. But he was misunderstood. You always people talk about maternal deprivation and paternal attachments. But he doesn't actually say that indirectly. And Rutter makes a point, we're not talking about just mother attachments. We're talking about secure attachments. And that can come from more than one person and from anybody. And you think about some cultures, actually, it's the grandparents that are the important one because they're consistent, whereas the parents are out working in the fields or whatever. So the point of that saying is, and I'm making my big plug is for saying that fathers need to know that how important they are in these early years of attachment and consistency, but also, and I'll come back to this in a minute, perhaps, that society needs to recognize, because fathers struggle with society not recognizing their importance. So if I start with the early years, first off, we know just generically that carer, notice no gender in that, carer insensitivity leads to patterns of insecurity, social withdrawal, and high risk of mental health problems. But if I turn it around and say carer sensitivity, wherever it is coming from, equals patterns of security and social comfortableness and free to be socially interactive, and lowers the risk of mental health. Because we say it in the negative, but we should actually emphasize the positive. And this can mean that this saying that the early experiences, sometimes we talk about the first 2 years, of how a child sees themselves, how they see each other, and the ways in which their caregivers have worked with them or been with them will serve as the building blocks for developing social and emotional well-being in the child. Now the question is, so what's the role? Just let's say, the other thing that because I have families, is that, as you know, Maslow says the child's needs are not just basically getting food and warmth and safety, but it's about how it enhances their sense of well-being, their interactional, and their sense of worth and self-actualization. And then it's put in what the individual feels they need to be, need to have, or they were born to do, as it were, to evolve ourselves. So there is a connection, a very deep connection between parents' investment and the child's competency, suggesting emotional involvement of parents really does matter in the child's emotional and cognitive development. So, but here's the key, is that actually, and this is where people don't, I'm taking right from the very small child, the father-child relationship is an important one, in some cases even more influential than the mother-child relationship. But we've all got to know that and understand that. And unfortunately, I'll give you a little personal example. I've been lucky through my career, even though I managed to do several at the same time. I've also always part-timed, and I brought up 4 boys and being a foster dad as well. And we've shared care, always. My wife's also part-timed everything, and I part-timed. I was in a job in the city, part-time, as a therapist. And the company, very successful, suddenly turned around and said, we want you to be full-time. I said, no. They said, why? And I made the point it was a woman asking me this. I said, why? Because I want to look after my children. Why? Because I want to look after my children. Why? She asked me 3 times. And then they decided, no, not good enough. They were withdrawing my contract, issuing me a full-time contract. If I didn't sign, I was in breach. So I took them to tribunal on sex discrimination. And that goes. And it goes further. Actually, they used my case to change the law in Parliament for the rights of part-timers in 2003. But I have to say, I didn't get to court because they kept making offers. I was so angry, I was determined to have my day in court. But the night before the court case, they quadrupled their offer, and my union said, you'd never get this if you go. But I deleted the clause saying no publicity, so I was in all the papers, and the national papers and things. But my point was, I was really angry because how dare people say fathers cannot be carers or are not allowed. So I say we've got a battle still of also, it's not only getting fathers to register that we are important in early years, and I'm going to make a point of it. There is one aspect, like particularly if you think about your own growing up and siblings. Now, older siblings, or the firstborn, has the biggest problem when the arrival of a sibling, particularly if there's, the gap is smaller. And so the arrival of a rival, because they've had sole attention, can be a major loss in experience, a loss of sense of self. But if father gets really involved with the eldest, and often elders are closest to fathers, if they get really involved, then although the child suffers a grief reaction of loss of mother's attention, because mother has to, first off in the initial stage at least, I should say, there's almost nothing mothers do that fathers can't do, except maybe breastfeed, but you can always express and things. So we can do it, there's pretty much, but there's still some time where there's taken away attention. I've had a number of 2-year-olds run into the hospital, jump on the bed and go whack on the baby, saying, how dare you? So if a father gets really involved, then although the child loses something, it gains something. But the father's got to recognize how important they are, and particularly that right at that point even, right? But of course, society's got to recognize, because they don't give flipping enough paternity leave or respect to actually giving fathers that respect of saying, yes, you're important, then it's, they're going to struggle to get there, like I gave you my example. I've given that example of particularly 8 to 12-year-olds. As I said, I worked as a social worker, and I worked with troubled families and troubled young people. Often, if families were splitting up, invariably it happened when the child was about 8 to 10 years of age, if you think about your maths and things like this. And this is a critical age, and I'm going to say, let's just where my next slide goes. Yeah. All right, now I'm going to come back to that for a second. It's a critical age because if you know about child, I think I'll refer to it later, but I'm jumping. That a child's world is an egocentric world, and therefore everything is about them until about 12 years of age. Then we go into a self-centered world, which is different, right? But when you're in this egocentric world, anything that changes, you will feel it's your fault. And of course, so often when 7-year itches or that breakup happens at that age, then a child needs to be helped through that. And fathers need to know that that child is going to think, I must be bad if father's disappeared, or he's saying he's coming but doesn't come. So the fathers need to know how important they are, particularly to their boys, because then the boys, it actually happens much earlier, boys begin to very early recognize that they're males. But particularly at that age, they are modeling on how to be a man and relationships. So fathers need to know critically how important. But I'll go further and saying, we've also got studies saying child's school behavior is strongly linked to educational attainment, and father's influence of that behavior is not only significant, but maybe more significant than mother's. So if father is involved, and I put this, I keep saying it, I was 20 years a school governor as well in primary school. And I'll give you a little example, that often in families, they think primary school is for mother. But we also know that, and we would log and monitor every child going through the school, but we would also do cohorts. And I'm sure you've seen it in the paper, because my school was no different, South London School. What group of children fall way behind other cohorts of children? Anybody got any ideas?
White boys.
White boys, exactly that. Now, you knew it, because not only did we find it in my school, but it was going everywhere. Why? And it was often because of absent fathers or fathers not engaged in the primary school level. And boys were thinking, well, if dad's not involved, then education can't be for me as a sense of being a man, so why should I bother? Right? So nothing would happen. And it is critical to get, but of course, if you've been in primary schools, like I'll just take this, I did take my kids to school, see the men, if there are men, at the school gate. They're isolated. Nobody talks to them. You see all the, I see smiles today, all the women talking, but not the men. So because I'm a stubborn bugger, I would, get involved in things like this. But it was quite hard for the men to feel like this was a place for them in primary school. So there's a whole, I'm talking about different ranges of things that need to be done even in those early years for fathers to conceptualize, one, how important they are, and to be allowed to be that important, as it were. Does it make sense? Yeah? And in fact, research has shown that, in fact, fathers' high involvement, as measured by reading, methods of discipline, taking trips, etc., is associated with fewer behavioral problems and lower criminality and substance abuse. And I've there added the white working class things. Now, I worked, as I said, in North Paddington, quite a violent, it was called the Maslows estate, which was well known in North Paddington for quite violence. A lot of young men getting into troubles. And actually, because I got to know them, obviously, they were very nice boys, but constantly in trouble with the police, in and out of youth custody, etc. Guarantee, single parents, very nice mums, but unable to set any boundaries or any models about how to be a male. Right? And I actually, in those cases, didn't even know the father. But my guessing is there needs to be a sense that fathers need to know how important they are, because when I've talked to fathers about this, they hadn't realized how critical they are to particularly boys, but actually, see if I've got it up, this goes to the next one, but it's not just boys. Actually, children model how to deal with society, how to cope with stresses, on how their fathers deal with it, much more than how their mothers deal with it. So if mother is very stressy at everything, that's not so important as if father gets really worked up or uses alcohol to cope with his stresses. So the child, per se, and I'm saying both girls and boys, but boys more particularly, look to fathers to model, how am I going to be? And how do I cope with situations? So obviously, if they're important, then if a father dies or disappears, the child will experience grief, but also a sense of self-worth, particularly if they're young, because I said of the egocentric child. And I also make the point, because I'm dealing with families broken out, I make the point, and too often, as we've said in society, the favour tends to go on the mother being the carer, although I try to ensure that that doesn't always happen, because I look at who is actually going to provide, not look at the gender. But if a father says they're going to come and visit and don't turn up, the child doesn't think you're a bad father, thinks, what's wrong with me? I must be bad, and that lowers self-esteem, so that's going to affect in their behaviour elsewhere. That's straight, you all know Piaget. And so in the parenting classes, I would be saying, like, for fathers, one, to learn how to be positive with their child. And so learning how to say, well done. A child grows up with constant criticism, won't succeed, because they'll say, I give up. Why should I bother? I can't please you. I spent a number of years, as I said earlier, working in the city. And I had a lot of very high achievers coming to me, very depressed. And they didn't have critical parenting. So they achieved. But they were constantly, they never got well dones. And they were frequently looking for well dones from their fathers. And I had to point out to them, well, if their fathers didn't tell them well done, because all they were doing was, maybe if I try a little bit harder, maybe then I'll get it. And they didn't realize the reason why their father wasn't giving it to them, because they couldn't, because they didn't feel good enough about themselves. And they had to let go and go and find the well dones elsewhere. Otherwise, they just became perfectionists. And I actually had a parent do it in front of me. They mother and father brought the 16-year-old son saying, fix him. Because he was having drug problems. And I talked to him, and he said he'd done reasonably well in his GCSEs. And I said to the parents, did you say well done for that? Because that was brilliant. And the father said, oh, if I say well done, he won't try any harder. Really bad psychology. All right. And in the family, if a child does not feel valued, how are they going to learn to feel valued, to value others? So and if they want to get attention, and all they're getting is, all children want attention, if they're not getting it positively, they'll get it negatively. So they'll act out in the school, for example. And then what happens in school? They just say, he's a troublemaker, kick him out. And you've probably seen the papers saying, how many children just thrown into diversion schemes. I even had my foster boy got kicked out of school, even kicked out of diversionary schemes. So I managed to persuade them how to work with him, and he's completely changed, and we still see him. But for a boy, it's being valued by their father, as I gave that example, is key to how they can feel about themselves as a man, as a growing up, and as a person. So, the question is what to do. We found, I'll give you a little example, that I was as a school governor, we would inspect classes, the primary school classes. So year 2, that's about 7. And there were 2 doing literacy, 2 groups of tables, one where children were reading well, one with children still struggling at 7, which kind of surprised me. But on the table of those reading well were all the girls except one. And on the table of those struggling were all the boys except one. And I asked the table of those reading, how many of you do your parents read to you at home? They all put up their hands. On the table not reading, none of them put up their hands. So my issue is, even if a parent wants to know one thing they can do, we know in this research, one thing is to read to your parents. And for boys, for the fathers from very early. And I've said also, of course, the father's role for the daughter is very important because it's a model of their first relationship with a man, and that positive relationship means that's how they're going to see themselves and value themselves in relationships as well. And if a child grows up witnessing or experiencing aggression and violence and is disrespected, he or she will do the same thing when she grows up. So parents need to reflect respect for their child by talking politely and with patience. And this is a modeling that can be learned from, because parents realize they think they had a model of authoritarian parenting. That is not positive parenting. So primary schools need to encourage the parents. Sorry, I'm going to slightly digress, because one of the areas like where I experienced it, as a foster carer, even the foster agency talk about the primary carer, and it's always the woman, right? And they acknowledge, like my wife and I, we equally cared, but it always went to we have to have a primary carer. I said, what's that telling the men who are there and have to be present? And even one man I meet with foster caring males, and they said, I am actually the key worker. I am actually the primary carer. And yet they still address all the letters to my wife. What message is that giving? This is, again, social issues about fathers. Although they need models, and because they are then models of the boys growing up to how to be fathers, but society needs to respect fathers as well. So I say, so primary schools need to involve the parents, attitudes to the fathers in schools, not only directing things to the mother. Thank you. Right, I'll just make this. I did my first degree in sociology in Sweden, and I noticed that in all the nurseries, like in the parks, you had all these young boys young men training to be nursery workers. This is in 1970, right? Where do you see male nursery workers in England? Don't see it. One pay, not respected. And we took a long time to get enough males in primary school. But it's so important for the boys' modelling of kind of the sense of, but it was to do with not paying enough. So they say, we change attitudes of fathers, but you also, as carers, but you've also got to make the opportunity and the feasibility. And if the father is absent, what about, we've had all the clubs, youth clubs closed down, and they need to be opened, and in there, what do children get, or teenagers get, is mentoring. If there's not a father, they need male role models. They need substitutes. And that needs, and to me, the maths is, you spend money, get these things, you're going to save money because of the costs of all these kids. I'm seeing them all in youth custody, in prison, and they're all actually very nice boys. But I've just had a conference yesterday at the Old Bailey. They say, oh, well, he's an evil, even the defending barrister saying, oh, he's a violent person, he'll never be, and he just said, we want to get rid. I said, no, he's not, he's just, I mean, this boy had been physically and emotionally abused every age he'd been. He had abandoned by his father, he never saw his father. His mother was an alcoholic and left him with an aunt who took meat cleavers to him and cut fingers off and things like this, and was constantly like, are you surprised? Did he end up in a gang and ended up with serious offences? Not surprising, but he's been traumatised by his whole childhood. But no, he's just an evil boy. Yeah. So we need that respect and men and fathers need to know how important they are, and society also needs to respect that, and then we can start to build structures around that. That's all I have.